How DLV delicious people, welcome to the review of Jurassic Park. So, we are here ultimately today to say that we saw Jurassic Park. Ultimately, a lot of people might ultimately have this movie in their Rolodex. They ultimately have a collection of every single Jurassic Park movie. At the end of the day, it's been a very long time for me to ultimately have seen this movie, and ultimately, I don't think I've seen it fairly frequently. I probably had seen it once at some point, and then every once in a while that it pops on TV, I catch little bits in here and there, but I never really care to watch the full fledged film because, man, was this film really long. It was really long for like a 2 hour film. I'm like, man, this feels like a 4 hour film because it's so it's so slow and methodical for most of this thing. Even when you could say it's like, well, no, like it kind of eventually picks up. Like to me, still, to be brutally honest, it never really picks up. Even when it supposedly picks up, it just never does. But here's the thing about this movie. This movie has an absurdly gigantic scale to it. Every single environment that they're in is like the biggest thing that you've ever seen in your life. Like you can never reach out and touch somebody. That's how big these environments are. By and large, that is the thing that was utterly lost on me within this first film. I'm like, man, like to look at these huge grand scales throughout this entire movie and then to see ultimately the sequels where they confined space everybody and everybody is just kind of just barely just they're just shoved in some bus somewhere or some Humvee or something somewhere, or they're just in some mansion that doesn't look all that grandiose and all of this and that. They really shrink down the scales of these movies compared to the other films that are just so wide open spaced and this and that. So there, in fact, going into this movie, I really thought that this movie ultimately just it feels very slow. It kind of feels like you go into this and ultimately it kind of really pulls off as a museum kind of film, or like a zoo. I would call it like a zoo kind of film, where ultimately you have a zoo film that ultimately really showcases correctly how a zoo normally is. um, Especially when you have, at a lot of times, a lot of people are desperately wanting to look for the attractions and the attractions are not there. So dare say, going into this, we have a movie that there is a lot of work done in this film. Just ridiculously, just the amount of time that it would probably have taken to build any number of these actual dinosaur-esque, monumentous, uh, machines to ultimately do scenes within this film. It was ultimately amazing to me to see these number of just the actual built to scale T Rex that was attacking these kids. It was ultimately amazing to see an actual dinosaur, probably puppeteered, attacking numerous other people, and this and that, and whatever, what have you. So, and plus, also with a mixture of also special effects, probably going in with this movie as well, during the time of which that, I think still holds up to this day. Anyways, going into this, we have it to where this movie could never be said is a bad film, just because I think it's one of those where you could ultimately break it down as a movie that, like, it it stands the test of time. Ultimately, in my mind, it's a movie about dinosaurs, and ultimately, I think everybody is always a dinosaur movie. No matter how bad it is, most of the time you rarely ever see a bad dinosaur movie. Look at Mighty Morphin Power Rangers the movie. which isn't a dinosaur film. I don't know why I don't know why I'm tapering back to that, because it's really not a dinosaur film. It quickly adjusts into being a an animal film, which it has animal zords. So, anyways, going into this, dinosaurs. So the interesting part about this movie is we have a lot of technical aspects of this film. We kind of have Grant, who ultimately is very much a character that is actually giving you actual, real, legitimate fact, seemingly, as if they knew exactly how dinosaurs act and maneuver and this and that. We ultimately have Jeff Goldblum in this movie that this is probably bizarrely out of a career of doing numerous amazing things. This movie bizarrely is a thing that he will always be known for, which I find odd. That it's like, dude, this guy's done numerous movies before this movie gets popping off, but then he all of a sudden, like, he does this film and then he does quite a few other films. Of course, like Independence Day is a big thing for a lot of people. But yeah, like, basically, like, it gets to the point of Jeff Goldblum being so iconic within this film that ultimately at some point people would recreate his image of him, uh like laying down in some place, and end up building a statued replica of this person, Jeff Goldblum, doing this pose in the Jurassic Park like movie. It kind of gets to the point to where ultimately, and Jeff Goldblum later on, like at his much older age, recreated this pose, which he put on like Twitter or something. So ultimately, we have it to where we have a interesting dilemma of them desperately wanting to build an entire theme park that ultimately otherwise has dinosaurs. But I think the problem is that they go way too far. Like, basically, like, dude, you can have an entire attraction theme park thing with dinosaurs, but, like, don't have the ones that actually eat people. Just kind of do the ones that are just kind of plant eaters, then you'd be completely fine. Like, dude, I wouldn't say build a T Rex. That's crazy. Like, even raptors, it's kind of like raptors are kind of crazy as well. Reasonably, within this movie, like, it is kind of interesting once, like, within this film, like, raptors weren't exactly a big thing early on, but then eventually, man, did they just every single movie it's like, yeah, we gotta have raptors, like, through this entire film we gotta have raptors that are repetitiously, we gotta have raptors like all the time. They gotta be a thing that ultimately is just 100% in this film from start to finish. Jurassic World. And we have to do this like it's going out of style, because that's the thing, that raptors, like, yeah, at first, like, became a small portioned villain in this thing, but man, did that kick off just this whole raptor thing, where it's like every movie you gotta have some raptor in it. It's just ridiculous. It was, to be brutally honest. Anyways, reason I like Jurassic World or Jurassic Park 2. I don't like any of the Jurassic Worlds. I like Jurassic Park 2, The Lost World. That's what I was going with. Ultimately, Jeff Goldblum's like, yeah, it's all great and beautiful now, but then there's the running and then the screaming. Yeah, it's basically how it gets once you realize justifiably that things are going to get loose. So, going into this movie, yeah, it comes to very, oh, nice and oh, pretty, and yeah, this is the greatest thing that I've ever seen in my life. But then eventually they very much break it down and tear it down, and then they realize that it's like, yeah, this looks all fine and nice, but like, wait till something goes horribly wrong. And that's ultimately their realization slowly but surely comes to life, literally. And the things that they're kind of conspirizing or theorizing is quite possibly going to happen comes to life within a very short period of time. Not slowly over a 5 year tour or something like that. So going into this, we are ultimately going to now just kind of break into spoilers about this film. I've already talked about it for 10 minutes. So let's go out of our way to say that, yeah, there have been a cluster of just overall, just so many Jurassic Park World movies. I'm sure they're going to probably change it to something else at some other point when they've lost track of how much money that they didn't make from some sequel. I don't like there's a lot of people that love Jurassic World. Ultimately, for me, it's a movie that I like. Like I liked the Jurassic Park Part Two, The Lost World. I liked that one, but then like ultimately, I kind of like after a while, like I kind of had like some bitter tastes about these movies, just because like it kind of goes the same beats every single time, and like Jurassic World is just the beatiest beat that you've ever beat it in with a band and a drum and a good time. But in my mind, let's go into spoilers about this movie. So in the very beginning of this movie, we have a bone collector curator, whatever you want to call them, people that dig up dinosaur-esh like bones. We have Grant and Ellie, who ultimately are two curators of dinosaur bones, digging them up, trying to find out where they're at. During the fact, we have Grant, who ultimately is talking in a very old-fashioned like manner. Like ultimately, like we have people using technological ways to find these dinosaurs, and Grant is like, well, what's the fun in that? Like ultimately, like, hey, we like it the old-fashioned way, and Grant comes off as a very old-fashioned person, and I enjoy him for that. So ultimately, when we have it to where a kid is kind of like mocking Grant, Grant ultimately is to tell him a story about how raptors behave and how ultimately they go around and they would try to kill somebody if there was one, if there was actually raptors around the situation present. It seems like we are known from right out of the get-go that Grant seemingly hates children to the point to where ultimately we just assume that Grant and Ellie are really probably never actually going to cementingly be a thing, from what I would assume. But ultimately, I could have been completely 100% wrong. So, going on to this, we ultimately have it to where Grant and Ellie are met by Hamilton, who ultimately is the man with the plan of a theme park that ultimately wants to have Ellie and Grant give him the signed, sealed approval because they have the scientific knowledge of dinosaurs to ultimately come on down to his theme park to ultimately have a really good time and otherwise seal the deal that that everything could be perfectly all good and fine when they otherwise wine and dine their way into a theme park that is filled with dinosaurs. So ultimately, we have it to where Grant and Ellie are going on a helicopter ride to this theme park because, of course, this theme park is on an island. All while we eventually have Jeff Goldblum, who is Malcolm, who is, as Hamilton puts it, like, I brought the scientists, you brought the rock star, because ultimately we have uh, Gennaro, the lawyer character. You ultimately have him who spurns Malcolm, who seems to be a very much rock star ish like guy that's wearing seemingly head to toe leather and sunglasses well, glasses of sorts. And so, reasonably, we have it to where ultimately Malcolm is talking about attraction and this and that. Like, it seems like Malcolm is consistently trying to hit on Ellie, even though he doesn't even know that Grant and Ellie are a thing. He just straight up does not care. Ultimately, he dare say, reasonably towards some portion of this film, he's basically just looking for the next woman to be with. Because ultimately, when looking at it, he has been married numerous times over, he has 3 kids, and so ultimately, like to him, love is just a fling away. So, anyways, we have it to where eventually there is some ruckus trying to land, and so otherwise people are grasping for seatbelts. Ultimately, Grant is having some issues with his, and Hamilton is trying to help him figure it out. But without a doubt, Grant just eventually ties his seatbelts together and then just goes, "Okay, all right, well, I figured it out." Because ultimately, Hamilton mentions like, "Well, if you're going to take so long to figure this out, by the time we land, you'll finally be able to figure this whole thing out." So eventually, it just gets to the aspect where they are at the Jurassic Park World Place thing, theme park. So, of course, we have Hamilton's like, "Welcome to the Jurassic Park." Yeah, fiddling with the Jurassic, letting us know via like they kind of tell us within this whole kind of conclusions that they draw to let us know exactly that they take they take like a fossil of a very Jurassic-ish like thing, and really it all comes down to figuring out blood. And so reasonably, it's like blood and fossils and all kind of nonsense to eventually birth a dinosaur. And so every single dinosaur is supposedly a female, because otherwise, like, if they were having males and females, they'd be busting out all kinds of dinosaurs and be millions upon millions of dinosaurs. So eventually, we have it to where the kitties all get off the trip to otherwise watch dinosaurs being hatched and otherwise ask about how the dinosaurs are being made. Because they're ultimately asking about like how fertilization and everything like that is to go on, yada yada yada. So going into this, we have it to where seemingly they get to see some showcasing of certain characters. They see some feedings of certain dinosaurish characters, and so ultimately they're realistically breaking it down and mentioning to Hamilton that they are very unsure. They're kind of very wiggly wobbly about really wanting to cementingly slap their name on some paper guaranteeing anyone's safety of any kind. Like Ellie perfectly breaks this down in amazing fashion of mentioning that like that you're looking at very poisonous like flowers. To you, you just put them out there because they're beautiful looking. But to me, I'm looking at them as like they're going to kill something someday. Um, and that's the problem of which that I have to tell you to just say thumbs up, I'm out, give me the money to slap my name on this thing. Really, ultimately, Malcolm kind of breaks it down in a very much like kind of very out there kind of explanation of basically how basically that these characters have kind of like have misbalanced nature, has kind of like gone against nature and gone against evolution, and basically uh, like destroying a lot of destroying a lot of things, and otherwise like talking about um, like all kinds of notions and stuff like that. And so recently, everybody's having the consensus that it's like, you know what, I don't think I can slap my name on this and say that you're going to be okay to put this theme park on. So, all the while, we eventually have a character called Nedry, or Nedry? Uh, Wayne Knight. Ultimately, a lot of people might know from Seinfeld and a lot of other things. Ultimately, at the end of the day, um, he is this character that is very much going to be doing some black market underhanded like deals to ultimately sell off some DNA to a black market dealer. So we have this character that is making these shady like deals and then ultimately getting this whipped cream like contraption that is going to like hold all these DNA samples and get them out to some black market ish like dealer. So this Nedry is going to very much like hack into the whole computer and basically have the theme park basically 100% like all in misarray, and then eventually uh, steal a bunch of stuff and then leave. But the only problem is eventually once this person does this, basically it not only affects everybody and starts to get some certain things unleashed, but then also eventually he ultimately is going to be in a world of hurt eventually at some point, which I'll talk about. So we go into this, and ultimately we have it to where seemingly Hamilton is very much just kind of remiss because he's ultimately just like, well, it seems like not everyone is going to be okay with, in a lot of ways, this park. But you know what? Like maybe I can just win over my target audience, which is of course Tim and Lex, which ultimately they are his relative family, and so ultimately like the target audience will ultimately get to see a Jurassic Park. So we ultimately have everyone go on the tour, and ultimately it seems that a lot of the dinosaurs are missing, and ultimately Jeff Goldblum's character has to forcibly mention that to Hamilton right in the camera. He's like, "Hey, yeah, it would be great if there was actually dinosaurs on your tour." And Hamilton looks right at him and he's like, "God, I hate that man." It's like, God, I hate him. So within this tour, Malcolm is ultimately very much again trying to get Ellie as an attraction, and ultimately talking about uh, kind of water hits and stuff like that, how basically sound can manipulate water and stuff like that, ultimately branching that out there. So eventually, oh, while in this journey, Grant is asking Malcolm about his family, if he has kids, and ultimately if he's married, and ultimately that's what I would have said or earlier that Malcolm yesterday. That's what I was said earlier about Malcolm having three kids and ultimately, uh, like kind of on the edge of looking for the next woman to basically marry at some point. Grant eventually is kind of shoved with both kids, Tim and Lex, because ultimately Ellie knew how much very well Grant would squeal about all this because he just like he has to really take he really has to take these kids and really like just be like, God, I just don't want kids. I just don't want to deal with this, especially the young kids. Just whatever. So because ultimately he's very much a person that wants nothing to deal with kids, nothing to do with them, and so ultimately Ellie really notices that and just kind of like shoves this right into his face anyways, like ha ha ha. So because ultimately Tim ultimately talks about how he read Grant's books, ultimately seemingly knows everything about dinosaurs just like Grant does, and so eventually he thought that ultimately it would be best for him to have a car shared with Grant, but ultimately it doesn't seem quite that it heads that way. And Lex eventually was told by Ellie to go in a car with Grant. So, anyways, we have it to where they go on this tour ride journey, and ultimately we end up having Grant and Malcolm in one car, seemingly, and we have the kids in their car. So they're going on to this tour, and eventually they start to realize that it seems that more and more that they're not seeing anything quite yet, but it seems that the longer they're waiting out there, it seems like things are starting to happen. Because what ends up happening is Nedry ends up taking some certain kind of fencing down. He ends up taking some technical stuff down, and ultimately that is leaving stuff in the lurch to eventually be unlocked, escaped, or otherwise just ultimately just effed for any number of people. So we have Nedry, who ultimately Nedry. I'm gonna get this name wrong consistently, but anyways, uh, we ultimately have it to where they ultimately have it to where uh, Nedry ends up going, getting the samples, and then eventually going into a locked area. He doesn't know where exactly he is going, and he gets lost. He gets lost, and then he ends up in a caged area where eventually he ends up getting attacked by some dinosaur, and eventually ends up uh, thinking that he is just gonna like get into a car, run this dinosaur over. But once he gets into his car, he ends up realizing he's going to be attacked by said dinosaur, and and this whipped cream can ultimately just falls out of the side of his car, and yeah, he's just basically never seen again. So we ultimately have Arnold, who is Samuel L. Jackson's character, who is going through and realizing that that Nedry had put on some things, or did some things that didn't quite seem right. Because ultimately what happens is Nedry mentions that he is going to be booting some systems, and it's going to take a while, and to not have no never mind about anything. And so eventually Samuel L. Jackson's character starts to get concerned, so ultimately he goes into his computer eventually and realizes, wow, this guy has really just hacked into the system and really just created this whole thing to where ultimately, like, it's not going to just be so easy to get into this person's computer. It gets to the point where it's going to have to take a very extremely long amount of time to decode this person's computer. It's going to take 2 million like different kind of codes to get into this person's computer to correct the system, because ultimately this guy was given control over this entire system to shut off or shut on power, to ultimately get certain things to work or not work or this and that. So ultimately they have it to where Hamilton and Arnold, while they're looking through this computer, are starting to realize how quite possibly dangerous all that this sounds, that there's a lot of power that is probably being shut off. There's a lot of cages that are being with the electrical fencing shut off and stuff like that. There's a lot of dangerous stuff that is being seemingly unprocessed or undone, and so ultimately Hamilton is ultimately going to to Gennaro and ultimately telling him that, like, hey, you need to go and get Tim and get Lex and get them back here as quickly as possible because they are right out there with all those dinosaurs and like something is going to pop off and surefire enough it does. So ultimately we have it to where we find out that this big old huge Esh-like cage houses a dinosaur that ultimately flings a thing of a goat and out of a leg, and because ultimately Lex is ultimately mentioning like, hey, where's the goat? We ultimately find a goat leg flung onto the the car of this, and then ultimately we end up finding a T-Rex who seems to have made his way into seemingly right next to these cars and by and large next to these tourists. So ultimately, of course, these cars can't really exactly go anywhere. So ultimately, dare say, we have it to where Gennaro ends up making it to the cars, but a little bit too late. So we have it to where ultimately Tim and Lex are ultimately crushed by the hood of this car. We have Gennaro eventually making his way, trying to get to the kids, but then ultimately, when spotted, he rushes into some seemingly bathroom like area that ends up getting annihilated by this dinosaur, and he ends up getting eaten. We ultimately have it to where Grant and Malcolm are ultimately shouting at the kids because ultimately they have a light going on and they need to shut off this light. So once they do, the dinosaur sees them, ultimately attacks their car, and then eventually Grant decides to ultimately get a flare out to ultimately distract the monster or to get it to some decoy to where he hopes that the T Rex is going to follow this flare. So the T Rex ends up looking at the flare and Grant tosses it out, um, hoping that he can get it to where the some kind of distraction is to have gone on. We ultimately have Malcolm who is yelling at Grant, telling him that, hey, like get the kids, like I'll be the distraction. So ultimately we have it to where Malcolm is grabbing a flare and trying to have the dinosaur, the T-Rex, follow him. And so reasonably we have it to where Grant eventually gets these kids that seem to be really very much closely falling off this side of this edge of this cliff. Because what ends up happening is we end up having Grant get these kids out of the car, but by and large we end up having them uh, kind of very much going through this tree, and then eventually the car falls into the tree, and so they have to rush to get down off of this tree because ultimately the the car is falling through the tree, so ultimately they need to get out of the tree, and then ultimately they need to eventually just go to find a safer place to feel protected because ultimately dinosaurs are all around. So we end up having Elsa and eventually the Muldoon eventually going to find out where these people are, and eventually they stumble upon Malcolm, who has hurt his leg. Ultimately, he has a tourniquet on it, and so eventually we have it to where we have Malcolm who is trying to explain what is going on. They take him and try to put him onto this Jeep and drive away, ultimately to be immersed by the T Rex, making his way to them. Ultimately, Malcolm desperately saying, must try faster, must go faster, go fast, drive, put the pedal to the metal. But consistently, Malcolm is consistently hitting against uh, the drive stick, and Muldoon is ultimately saying like, "Dude, I'm trying to drive here." But yeah, so interestingly enough, we have it to our Grant with Tim and Lex are ultimately stuck into this tree, ultimately looking at some dinosaurs that are not trying to kill them. Ultimately, they're just trying to eat the forest life. And ultimately, there are some interesting jokes done by Tim, ultimately mentioning about dinosaurs and a dinosaurish dog and this and that. So we ultimately have it to where it seems that Lex is asking like what were to happen if any of these dinosaurs that are actually going to try to kill us, like what are we gonna do? And Grant just says that he's like, well, maybe I'll just stay up all night and just like we'll probably be safe then. And ultimately I'm assuming that's not really what Grant does, because ultimately he probably figures that they're completely fine up in this tree, ultimately. So we have it to where, and I didn't even get to the point of the pregnant triceratops, the pregnant dinosaur, that ultimately uh, they kind of look at, and they kind of go into and kind of try to see ultimately what they can do to help out this pregnant dinosaur. They kind of go onto his chest to check its breathing and stuff like that, and this and that. Anyways, it's kind of a moot point, but ultimately it's kind of a quick thing to throw in there. So we ultimately have it. The votes have it. We ultimately have it to where ultimately uh, they are very much in desperation to try to figure out how to solve everything and try to get everything working yet again, that they otherwise decide to reboot the entire system. They otherwise decide to just shut everything off and shut it back on, because ultimately finding out and figuring out 2 million things of code would take viciously too long. So they otherwise just decide to put a big, huge reboot on the whole entire thing. Samuel L. Jackson's character Arnold consistently mentions that, in theory, he hopes that everything would come back on and it would work. It would work completely fine, but again, in time, it's just a theory. So ultimately, it seems that once they do start to do a quick reboot on things, they otherwise notice is like, well, hey, maybe this will just be easily that we can just start rebooting everything. So eventually, once Grant and them decide to wake up for the day, they otherwise go out of their way to start kind of figuring out how to make it through this theme park. They try to eventually go and find some prey like dinosaurs that are ultimately kind of flocking together and running around. And ultimately, Grant notices that they're all flocking together, seemingly to run away from some prey. So ultimately, all these dinosaurs seem to run all in one pattern, and so it feels like a stampede. So Grant, Tim, and Lex all start to run in the opposite direction, so that way they can otherwise justifiably um, run underneath some big logs that the dinosaurs would jump over, to ultimately notice where exactly, after assessing like what is the bigger thing that ultimately is attacking these other smaller dinosaurs, and it ends up, of course, being a T Rex, because ultimately, when they adjust and thrust their eyes, they ultimately see a T Rex ultimately eating a smaller dinosaur-like figure, and so ultimately, uh, they talk about how bloody it is and how gruesome it is, and this and that. So we ultimately have it to where they otherwise decide to just go, okay, well, we can see a T-Rex clear fire enough from a distance, so maybe we should get away from that as far as we can. So ultimately, we have we have these three people otherwise deciding to go and look at this fence and ultimately trying to notice, because it says right there on the side that it has 10,000 volts. So Grant ends up smacking a piece of wood against it and ultimately realizing, okay, it doesn't seem to be working. Ultimately, he grabs it and touches it. And the funny part is he mentioned, or he tries to do like a little joke like thing to ultimately like make it feel like he's getting electrocuted, but he's not. And so the kids are like, ah, very funny. So ultimately, Grant and them just decide to otherwise just climb this fence and get over it, because ultimately the T-Rex is sounding much more and more very close. So all the while they are doing that, Muldoon and Ellie are deciding to go into the place and reset the breakers, ultimately trying to put back on the power, to ultimately have it be that the park is much more safe. So Ellie and Muldoon go out of their way to eventually go into the breaker room, and they tend to lose a little bit more than some. Here's where it starts to get interesting. So Ellie ends up starting to turn on the breakers and ultimately ends up after that, surefire enough, with a raptor in her midst. Ultimately, eventually, she goes into trying to escape said raptor, trying to keep him caged and closed, and ultimately, she goes into having an arm on her side, which ultimately she realizes could be Muldoon, but then eventually all she gets is an arm. So eventually she starts running away as quickly as humanly possible, because it seems that a cluster of raptors are on the loose, so otherwise she is out of there. So we eventually have it to where Malcolm and Hamilton are kind of in a separate enclosed space, ultimately kind of just talking things out with Ellie and this and that. So eventually we get to the point to where ultimately we have the kids who are ultimately at this fence, and then ultimately we have Tim, who eventually gets shot off of this fence because ultimately the power comes back on with Ellie. So ultimately, they kind of have to nurse him back to life. They kind of have to do CPR to get him back to life, and this and that. So we have it to where ultimately Grant and the kids end up making it back to within the place that ultimately Ellie and Arnold are at. So ultimately, they end up trying to very much try to figure out how to reset the system, and ultimately, they end up thrusted upon having a raptor trying to be within this door. We ultimately find it to where the raptor is going to try to bizarrely open this door, and Grant is pressing his body against this door, trying to prevent this. Ultimately, mentioning to Ellie to set the locks on, but instead, Ellie just presses her body against the door. And so eventually, it seems that one of the kids, Lex, is ultimately trying to get into this computer and figure out what exactly to do to go through and lock this door back up, because ultimately the system to her of this computer is very familiar. So eventually she goes out of her way to eventually go into figuring out this door locking mechanism. Um, but eventually that doesn't stop these dinosaurs to continue to come in here. Eventually they go onto the upper part of this building, kind of like the I would call it like a like basically like the wall has of course like these little panels that you can kind of like pop open and kind of have a ladder and go into the top of this like ceiling ash like portion. So reasonably it's just them kind of walking around the ceiling, and eventually raptors are kind of hearing the sounds of this, so ultimately they're popping their head through some of the panels to ultimately get kicked or something like that, to where ultimately they ultimately end up like not going through this. We have another whole portion of time where eventually the raptors are in the kitchen, because ultimately Lex and Tim are kind of scavenging around the kitchen, and ultimately, yeah, these raptors are everywhere. So we have it to where everybody is trying to figure out what the heck to do. We eventually have it to where Malcolm and Hamilton are having a jeep at some point kind of drive them around the park, trying to eventually get to Grant and them. But ultimately, what happens before that is that we have the Raptors that are eventually circling around, getting to Grant, Lex, Tim, Ellie, and it seems that eventually it's going to be the point where it seems like their lives are eventually otherwise going to come to an end. But then eventually the T Rex ends up showing up at the perfect time and end up gobbling up all these little raptors to be the hero of this story. And then ultimately we have, of course, the Jurassic Park like banner falling. Basically the synonymous video that you're or the synonymous thing that you're going to see every single time whenever you see a Jurassic anything. You're always going to see that scene. You're always going to see that exact same scene where T-Rex is always the hero at the end every single time. So going into this, yeah, it was a really interesting film. Going into after the whole T Rex event, we have all the people running into this van, eventually driving off to eventually just getting out of this park and eventually going onto a helicopter to eventually getting out of here. But eventually they otherwise notice that it seems that, of course, for every single time that they do an ending of a helicopter on some movie somewhere for a Jurassic World movie, they ultimately realize that some of the dinosaurs are getting out, but they're like, whatever. Like, it is kind of interesting to ultimately know full well that when, like, I never really quite understood where the whole quote comes from, where life finds a way. Um, or it finds a way. I never really understood where that come from. Now realizing in this movie that ultimately Grant, when he was looking at the hashed eggs, telling us that the dinosaurs are adjusting to not having a male counterpart, so they end up just producing eggs regardless. Um, so like that moment was kind of interesting to me to see the life has a way, and ultimately I'm like, oh, okay, so that's where that line came from. And ultimately who knew that that would be a line that would be synonymous with this movie, to where ultimately it would consistently come back to it at some point in time. So going into this, I thought that this movie was pretty fun. There was probably one thing that I didn't bring up in the beginning of this, where ultimately people were there was a worker of their people at Jurassic Park that had gotten eaten, and somebody was suing Hamilton for millions upon millions of dollars because of this guy's death. Um, and so, yeah, that's why they had to try to figure out how to figure out some people that would have like some real deal seal of approvals of the park. Funny enough, Grant ends up turning to Hamilton at the very end of all this, and he's like, "I'm sorry, sir, but I'm not going to give my approval on your park. And ultimately, Hamilton says, like, well, so do I. or, like, yeah, like basically, he doesn't even approve of his park anymore because ultimately something could go horribly awry. Funny enough, how they stubbornly still do numerous sequels trying to go back to these places or ultimately try to do yet another Jurassic Park over and over and over again, like the broken wheel of it all, ultimately just to continue to have these things go horribly awry, justifiably. No matter how much technology that they have, no matter how great that they think things are going, there's always going to be that moment where things are going to horribly awry. And so, justifiably, like Jurassic World is probably the reboot of this whole thing, because ultimately they just assumed that everybody at some point had forgotten about a lot of the Jurassic Park movies, and so they need Jurassic World to ultimately reassess everything. So, going into this movie, I thought a lot of it was fun, but I thought it was a lot of it was a big stretch of time. In my mind, I was like, man, this movie is so slow. But then again, ultimately, it's so iconic. It's so like reasonably one of those movies where you kind of just go in here and like dinosaurs, yay, and that's all that you really have to say about this movie. So it of course has to be a positive experience, just because ultimately you can't stop but say that this is a great movie, even if you hate it, you think that it's stupid, or you think it's the dumbest movie that you've ever seen or whatever. I don't know. Like, I don't know if anybody could negatively say anything about Jurassic Park at the end of the day. Even though I probably tried to through this review. Like, I think that it's so iconic. I think it's like reasonably, for me, there's so many great moments going on in this film. Of course, like I think Jeff Goldblum is a really great character in this movie. Malcolm, I wish that he would have kind of done more films. If ultimately you could have had like the Grant or Malcolm combo more than once, I think that would have been great overall for these movies. But it's always seemed like you'd have one or the other, which is completely fine in time that looking at some of these movies. So yeah, couldn't like recreate like the very first Jurassic Park all over again. In the end, they kind of just use splashes of certain character appearances here and there, but dare say, like, yeah, it gets to the point to where ultimately you're just kind of like going like meh, like a little remiss about ultimately they couldn't justify otherwise having the band get back together again. But anyways, yeah, overall some very iconic moments. Of course, the whole the flare thing is really just has been easily been overdone repetitiously. A lot of people have mimicked that moment through tons and tons of time. Uh, Basically, it's so iconic. Everything about this movie is like when you go into a dinosaur movie, every single time everybody says the word Jurassic Park when you think of a dinosaur film. You can't like a lot of people will pull out some cards of like, well, yeah, Power Rangers, or somebody will say some other dinosaur movie, but Jurassic Park always comes up. And whenever there's a time where Jurassic Park is probably on, any number of people will probably watch it. Um, yeah, like to me, the overall consensus, yeah, it's a long movie. It's 2 hours, sure, and it's a really long stretch, and ultimately, it's a lot of technical stuff. But at the end of the day, it's still a fun experience. It's still a very interesting movie that you can enjoy it for the viciousness of the T Rex, uh, and you can enjoy it for those moments. And yeah, again, I appreciate the grandiose like scale of it all, and I really appreciated this overall film. So at the end of the day, that's all I wanted to say about Jurassic Park. Let's get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.